Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
This is Sarah Jack. Today we're talking with Icy Sedgwick, author, folklorist, diviner, and host of the Fabulous Folklore Podcast, to discuss her book, Fate or Fortune, The Art of Divination.
Divination is one of those practices that shows up in witch trial history. For instance, the sieve and shears used as evidence of witchcraft in Salem, the witch cake baked to identify a witch, the egg and glass that young women used to glimpse their future husbands. These practices were part of everyday life, but they also carried real legal consequences for real people.
Today we're looking at divination as a whole, as a body of folk knowledge, and as a deeply human impulse to seek out what is hidden or unknown.
Divination has been practiced by adherents of many belief systems across centuries and cultures.
Josh, is there a favorite technique that you learned about?
Can I say two?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really into the dowsing. I've been very interested in that for many years. I watch programs on TV sometimes with people doing it. And I'm also very interested in weather omens and how to read the signs that the weather is giving you. There were some fascinating ones that Icy talks about in the book.
Well, as you saw, I got quite excited while we were discussing dowsing about a movie that features dowsing. So I do love that one. But also, I was really fascinated with scapulomancy, which is the reading of burned or marked shoulder blades of animals. That's like very interesting to me because several different cultures have practiced that.
I really like the story that Icy shares with us in the episode about that. And for our listeners, you will also hear about palmistry, cartomancy, playing card divination, tarot, Lenormand, the Boleyn Oracle, tea leaf reading, geomancy, reading livers, plastromancy, nephromancy, death omens, pendulum divination, fortune cookies, and other food-based divination.
So whichever technique caught your interest, this conversation has something for you, all of our listeners.
Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast. Icy Sedgwick, author, folklorist, diviner, and creator at Fabulous Folklore Podcast. Tell us about your work and expertise.
Oh, I hate this question because you don't want to sort of big yourself up too much. And you've covered everything there. So I'm a writer and researcher with a specialism, I guess, on folklore, and within that, obviously, various little subsections like divination and plant lore and things like that. And I am the host of Fabulous Folklore Podcast. And my background's actually in art history and film studies. So I kind of wandered into this after a lifelong interest in folklore and legends. And I think everyone kind of has some kind of gateway that takes them into this kind of thing. And for me, it was actually local history. So that's how I've ended up in a roundabout kind of way where I am now.
Well, we just read your book, Fate or Fortune, The Art of Divination, and it's really wonderful book that we recommend to the audience. Your book looks at divination from a folklore perspective. Can you give us some background on what folklore is, how it's defined?
I think it's one of those questions where if you ask every folklorist, they'll have a different answer. And I think the more simplistic version of it is that it's a body of knowledge that is shared within and transmitted by ordinary people. So it's like not the academy, it's not learned classes at where it's ordinary people. And in some ways it encodes information to help keep people safe in various ways. We see some of that with the different types of divination, which obviously we'll look at later on, I think. But then it's also a way of obviously just preserving the stories of places, the stories of people, and then passing them down, usually in an oral fashion. And then all of that got written down in the 19th century and then got fixed. So folklore is ongoing. Everybody contributes to folklore. It's not just an old thing. So I always sort of say if anybody has like rituals they do before watching their favorite game, or if you have things you do at Christmas, it's all part of folklore in its own way, which is what's quite cool about it.
Is folklore distinct from mythology and legend?
I think so. There are different ways of trying to differentiate between the three areas. And I think one of the definitions I saw, and I wish I could remember who said this, was mythology was like the codified set of beliefs everybody just sort of buys into. So if you think of, say, for example, the Greek myths, yes, there are different versions, but they're more state sanctioned in a way. Legend tend to be sort of bigger in scope, I think, and they'll feature things like dragons and unicorns and giants and what have you. Although people can then become legends in their own way, because like Robin Hood would be a really good example of him. And obviously there's sort of tons around the world, really. And then, of course, folklore itself tends to, I think, differentiate itself because it often deals more with like mundane matters or the everyday in a way that legend just doesn't. Like, I don't remember reading a legend about King Arthur where he sort of concerned about doing his laundry or something, which is a shame because that would be quite interesting. Whereas obviously folklore, here's how you can add this particular plant to your wash to bring luck to the household kind of thing. So it tends to be a much more accessible, I think, form of storytelling.
And how would you define divination?
This is another one that's got an interesting etymology to it, really. So Merriam-Webster says that it is, and I quote, the art or practice that seeks to foresee or foretell future events or discover hidden knowledge, usually by the interpretation of omens or by the aid of supernatural powers. And it also involves insight and perception. But the word itself actually comes from the late 14th century. And if we trace it back, it comes from Old French and then originally Latin, from divinare, meaning to be inspired by a god. So originally it would have been about the gods giving us information, but then over time it sort of evolved to mean finding out information that's hidden or finding out about the future through supernatural means. Although I think people kind of have a different definition of it even now, although I wouldn't want to tell people what they believe, but I think there is an additional avenue that's been added, that it can also be a means of seeking to understand yourself through divinatory means rather than it necessarily being an external factor.
If I keep bumping into the same words or symbols in unrelated areas, is this divination happening?
Some people would argue it is. Some people would probably put that down to synchronicity, which you kind of can't move in certain aspects of the internet without coming across that. And I think part of it, if you're being really skeptical, if you wanted to be a bit Agent Scully about this, you would be like, is that not just that you've primed yourself the first couple of times you saw it to recognize it more? And you've put some kind of emphasis on that because it keeps reappearing. Other people would be like, yeah, but when you consider the sheer amount of information that we're just inundated with on a daily basis, the fact that something would keep cropping up again and again, it does kind of feel a little bit more like someone or something is trying to get your attention. And then from that, you would decide what that actually means. And I think that's where you get things like angel numbers and stuff like that kind of fall under that now. But yes, you could have definitely gone, oh, that is the God speaking to me in the past.
What does the practice of divination offer to those who are seeking information?
I suppose it depends what you're using it for. If you're using it because you have a situation and you're not really sure what to do, and one problem that you might have if you just ask other people, how would you handle this situation? There's always the fact that people will kind of tailor their advice according to you and what they know of you, and that may or may not be helpful. And the idea of divination is because you're kind of seeking it from like a third party, as it were. It doesn't really care whether it upsets you or not. So it's just supposed to be a more objective way of checking things out, I think. But I think in some ways it's a nice way to connect into your own humanity and everybody else's humanity, because humans have been doing this for literally thousands of years. And I think everybody's like, oh, what's going to happen next? About like literally everything. I mean, look at the fact they have the psychic animals when there's stuff like the World Cup on, predicting who's going to win different matches. Like, people have an interest in what they don't know. And I think that's what divination offers. It's an ability to know or to find out something that has previously been beyond your grasp for whatever reason.
How are omens related to divination?
I love omens, which is a weird thing to sort of say, but I think there's sometimes a feeling that you've been given an answer without actually necessarily having to have asked a question. So in folklore in particular, which is obviously my focus, they often appear as something that someone notices in the environment. and then the person can look out for what is going to come to pass. So weather omens are a really common one, and they're one that we really still engage with even now, I think. Death omens, there's, oh my God, you can't move in folklore without falling over death omens, particularly in Welsh folklore, it's full of them. And I think the weather omens are really interesting because some of them are rooted in observation. So if you see the buttermilk clouds, where they look a bit like curdled buttermilk, they usually indicate that rain's going to come. So if you see them, it's usually going to be within 12 and 24 hours. Or there are various rhymes around the world about what happens if you see a halo around the moon, but they nearly all relate to the fact it's going to rain. But the halo is caused by moisture in the air, so it means that there's a higher chance of rain anyway. So I like weather omens are, in some ways, are a really interesting way of providing information in an easy way for people to remember. And then they act a little bit like divination because this is what's going to happen, but it is actually in some cases rooted in some kind of observation. You can do the same thing with seaweed. If you hang seaweed up and it goes sort of dry, then obviously there's not enough moisture in the air, so you're not likely to get rain. But if it goes wet and floppy and it reacts to humidity, then obviously again, there's that. Things like that I think are really lovely because it shows how people were paying more attention to the world around them before sort of we all kind of started going, oh, what does Google say? And so I think it's quite interesting looking at omens. There are some omens as well that people would specifically go looking for, but that's when you start going into the realms of like royalty looking for auspicious omens, like the best day for a coronation and so on. And you might actually turn to something like astrology for that. But for ordinary people, omens tend to be something that presents itself as, I know you didn't ask, but here's the information anyway. And I quite like that about omens.
That's a really neat part of divination. What I really gathered from reading your book is there is this two-way thing. You may be looking or you may be surprised with some information that jumps out at you from something you're doing or something you see.
Yeah, and it's quite funny because to me, it almost makes a case for being more observant about the world around you. I did a ghost walk in London a couple of weeks ago, and it was really funny because there were like two crows scrapping midair right next to the Houses of Parliament. And of course, now we've got all this, who's going to be our leader? You kind of go, was that an omen or was that just two crows having a fight over some food? So I think it's a way to help enchant the world around you, but it also helps you to pay more attention to what's going on, which can be really mundane. And it can be something like you've lit a candle and you notice that the flames change direction, but there's no drafts. So, ooh, what does that mean? Or it could be, oh, it looks like it might actually rain. Maybe I should take an umbrella today. So it can be super mundane and super boring, but it can also be a little bit more exciting or scary, depending on what the omen is.
How is fortune telling distinct from divination?
Fortune telling is an interesting one because some people sort of treat them as interchangeable sort of terms. And I think there is a bit of a class distinction in some regards, that some people see fortune telling almost as something that people at the poorer end of the spectrum might turn to, or is something that gullible people might do, but divination is this serious thing that the learned men do. But for me, I think Cyril and Jarrell at Collective Cartomancy actually said, and I quote, divination looks at possible outcomes for your current situation. Fortune telling tells you about the most likely outcome of your situation. So the difference between them is divination's like, here are your options, and then you get to decide. Whereas fortune telling's like, if you stay where you are right now, this is what's most likely to happen. So I think ultimately it depends which way you're approaching it as to what the difference is. But ultimately, I think it just comes down to which way you look at the options that are given by your tool of choice.
And how did fortune telling historically offer a career path for women who didn't have that access to the education that those elite men did?
I really love this because there are certain jobs throughout history where it kind of comes along and it's like, oh, this is actually really well suited to you. And I think part of it comes down to the fact that because there's that link with intuition, literacy is sort of less necessary. And quite a lot of the forms of fortune telling might rely on pattern recognition or visual symbols that you could just learn and remember. So it becomes accessible to a wider range of people anyway. And I think obviously there's certain stereotypes that get attached to that as well. But then if you look at certain practices, so things like chiromancy or like palm reading, don't involve any tools. So it's even more accessible. So you don't have to have all the expensive kit that your fellas with their grimoires and whatnot would have been touting about to show how learned they were in their area. So these women would be able to just rock up and start practicing pretty much as they were, which is really cool. You do find quite a lot of the female cunning folk practicing various forms of divination. It's really interesting that when you look at what they're looking at, it's things like who stole something, is someone pregnant or not? And it's really mundane and practical. And it's the kind of thing that I think women were probably quite preoccupied by anyway. So the best person to go and see about this would likely be just a woman who knew how to do this stuff. And when you look at the male cunning folk who offer divination, they often can read and write, and then that adds to their magical reputation. We've got a male cunning man in Newcastle's history where I live who used to do written charms for people. And you think that could have literally just been a recipe for anything, and no one would know if they couldn't read. So I think the fact that the women got round that by just simply looking at other tools and things that were available to them, they basically just managed to make it their own and make it relevant to what they were interested in as well.
What kind of tools would they use?
The weirdest one is by far the Sivan shears, and for ages I couldn't work out how it worked, and eventually I found a drawing of it in one of the books that's ascribed to Cornelius Agrippa. So you get a big pair of shears that they look a bit like the ones that people still use to literally shear sheep, and then you jam like a round sieve. And I've only ever seen people use these in the garden in the 21st century, so I was kind of like, oh yeah, that would be what you would use to sieve things. And you jam that into the blades, and then you're supposed to kind of suspend the whole thing from a finger, and then it's supposed to turn around according to the directions, but most people think it actually probably just swung a bit like a pendulum. And then you could obviously give an answer and see if it responded in the affirmative or negative to what you were saying. So again, it's using household items that you would have had lying around. You could easily have separated them in case anyone was getting a bit sort of curious about what it was that you were doing. And you could then just use them for other stuff during the rest of the day. So it's really interesting when you look at a lot of the ephemera that's available to buy now to do divination with. And you're like, people were just literally using what was in their shed. And I quite like that. That's the main one I think you come across with a lot of the English ones anyway. Although some people did do things like writing up astrological charts and things like that. But I didn't really cover astrology so much because there's actually not a huge amount of folklore about it. It's just something people did, including the clergy, which I find absolutely amazing. The number of priests and so on who were really into astrology. And I just think that's really quite fascinating. And it gives you another insight into how actually the church turned a blind eye to an awful lot of stuff, as you could argue they possibly still do.
We talk a lot about 17th century New England around the Salem witch trials and other witch trials. And we've come across the Sivan scissors and the egg and glass and the witch cake. They're all used in the Salem witch trials. The Sivan scissors is used as evidence against somebody that they're practicing witchcraft. But then the egg and glass and the witch cake, they actually are used by accusers to the witch cake to try to detect who is the witch. And the egg and glass is just used in the traditional who's going to be my husband in the future kind of way. And those are considered innocuous, where the Sivan seers is harmful, apparently, and can be witchcraft. So how can divination get confused and be called witchcraft?
It's funny because I know there's, I guess you could call it a divination that you run into in English witchcraft history. And I know there was one used in I want to say it was the Flowers case where one of the witches was accused and she was given a piece of bread to eat. And if she couldn't eat the bread, it proved that she was a witch. And you think, so you're essentially using witchcraft to detect a witch. Okay, we're cool with irony then. And awesome. And I think it's funny how the egg and glass one, and I suspect with that one, there were some people who looked down on it because they kind of saw it as like, I don't want to say low, but it's kind of almost seems to be quite common. And almost gossipy in a weird sort of way. But I think because of the fact that it's just trying to get information about something to do with your future husband, it's probably seen as, oh, well, we know we don't want to admit that you're going to have to find a husband in order to financially support yourself. We're all in on that, so we'll let you get on with doing whatever it is that you do. There's one example I came across where a woman tried making one, and I genuinely don't know. I'd love to see this. I don't know how it worked, but the egg white in the water formed the shape of a desk, and then she married a teacher, and I'm like, how on earth did she get a desk out of it? That's amazing. So I think that's probably seen as the harmless stuff that girls do about boys, which I suspect is why it was probably seen as quite innocuous. Whereas something like the 7 Shears, that's often used to detect criminals. So there may be a sense of, oh, you're encroaching on our turf a little bit there. You know, that's for us to do, not for you to do. So I think it's possibly the intent it was used for that is a reason why people got funny about certain types of divination, but then other ones were perfectly acceptable.
There was an accused witch during the Salem witch trials named Candy, and the magistrates had her eat grass. It's so demeaning. They had her eat grass during her examination.
Yeah. They also burned a puppet and they dipped a puppet in water just to see what would happen. And the afflicted people freaked out when those things happened. They were burned, they were almost drowned, but they saw what was happening.
It is interesting that you sort of wonder with situations like that, how differently that would play out, sort of, how do I put it, in a different setting. Because if you're already in a really tense, psychologically charged environment, and you already have this set of beliefs that have probably been drummed into you since birth, it's a bit like the witch bottles as well. When people used to sort of gather sort of like a urine of somebody who'd been supposedly afflicted by witchcraft, put it in a bottle and then hold it over the fire, and it would apparently cause pains for the witch. To me, I would only think that was true if she wasn't in the room and had no idea you were doing that, and then turned up and was like, oh my God, what is that? And so I sometimes wonder if that's the same thing with stuff like burning puppets and so on. It's like, were the people who were freaking out, were they aware of what was happening? Were they watching what was happening? Or were they somewhere else and couldn't possibly have known? That's the interesting thing, I think.
That's how I figure they should have run the court, would be to have the people in a different location, in another room at least, and they do the tests, and then they say, okay, what happened with you guys just now, without letting them know what kind of test was even done. So, but I mean, they ran witch trials wrong. That's basically my point.
I think everyone agrees on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So there are factors that influence one's understanding and use of divination, like environment, culture, and social standing? What do we need to know about that?
I think it's one of those things as well where all of those things are going to influence sort of what you're going to ask about, and then also the kind of tools you're going to gravitate towards. And I think this is where it's really interesting when you look at the 18th century in particular, when you start getting this interest in reading tea leaves, because all of a sudden tea's this massive thing from the 1600s. Or geomancy went through this weird resurgence of interest where it was almost reduced to a parlor game. And then you've got obviously people suddenly going, oh, hang on, we can use playing cards. And there's these manuals you can find on Internet Archive where these obviously quite wealthy people who had very little else to do, obviously were then exploring these things almost in quite a game-like fashion, I think. So it was almost, they kind of treated them a little bit as a novelty, whereas I feel like somebody who had more to gain and less to lose would potentially have been using the same tools to actually find out how to make their material circumstances better. So I do think there's a bit of a class dynamic in some of it. But then I think when you look at a lot of the love divination by comparison, that's obviously going to be influenced by the fact that, like I said before, you need a husband in order to provide for you. So you're going to do as many of these things as you can to find out if you're actually going to have a husband, because what's your alternative? And I think it's quite interesting when you look at the types of plants that are chosen. Obviously, they then become quite regional and so on as a result. So it's quite, I think it's quite notable to see that people basically had the same preoccupations that we all do, but it's just the kind of expressed slightly differently. So where we might sort of download Tinder because would like to meet someone. Obviously, in an environment where you don't have as many opportunities to meet someone, looking out for an Ashley so that you can put it in your shoe to hope that the first person that you meet is going to be your intended. You can see why people would gravitate towards things like that.
I'm really fascinated by the fact that it appears from what things that I've read in stories, and you know a lot more than me, so if I'm like missing something, please correct me. But a lot of the love divination would be like a social game or a group thing. And I was thinking about how the results that come out, you're looking at what's happening for your friend over here. And are you the one drawing the short straw? That it must have been comforting but stressful.
Yeah, I mean, there are some absolutely weird ones. One of them was intended for like children to play, and they were directed to kind of pull things out of a bag. As if you got a thimble, it meant this, and if you got a ring, it meant you'd get married. And obviously, some poor kid would get nothing, and you're like, oh, that's just cruel. And I mean, there's another weird one which involved, again, it was adults at a party, and it was like plates. And if you put your hand in the one that had the flour, it meant that, you'd have wealth. But if you put your hand in the dirty water, it meant you would die. And so many of them involve who's going to die this year as well, which is amazing. And you just like, imagine doing that on New Year's Day. Who's going to die this year? And it's just, what do you do if they don't? You know what I mean? So it's kind of, yeah, there is definitely a group dynamic, and I think there's quite a lot of interesting ones for the groups of girls where they are supposed to be done in groups. And I don't know if that's just a general safety thing or if it's because girls like doing these kind of things together so they can have a bit of a giggle if they get a good result, and everyone kind of pretends that they're not going to have a bad one. Because let's be honest, somebody in the group would have a horrible answer, and then you'd be like, oh, this is a bit rubbish.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course, there's the legend with the Salem witch trials that there was the girls formed a circle and they did divination and they did the egging glass, and one of them saw a coffin in the glass and really freaked out. And that's how she got afflicted in the first place and kind of invited the devil in. But that's not actually the way it is in the historical record either. It's just that a girl used the egging glass and may have seen something she didn't like and, had a worry about it. What is dowsing and how's that used and what's it used for? What are some methods?
Dowsing's fascinating because when I was writing the book, I actually did a podcast episode about water dowsing, which I know in America is called water witching. So many people got in touch and were like, oh my God, like my dad does this, my granddad does that. And so many people knew someone or had done it themselves with some success. And it's most regularly seen, I guess, there's two different ways of doing the water dowsing. One way, traditionally, it's technically three, but you'd either have one sort of forked branch and you kind of carry, I love the fact that I'm demonstrating this and you can't really see what I'm doing, but you would kind of hold like a Y-shaped branch and have each of the arms of the Y in each hand. And then you basically point the bottom of the Y downwards, and then when it kind of twists around in your hand, that's when you found water. Much easier way of doing it is with the sort of rods that are bent at like a 90-degree angle. So you walk around holding them, and then when they swing and cross again, that's when you're in the right spot. Or you can do pendulum dowsing over a map, where you can pretty much use anything that hangs. So like a key on a chain is a good example, over a map, and then when it sort of circles or whatever, again, that's the spot that you want to go digging for your water in. But dowsing ends up being used for some really weird things. So there's a whole plethora of rituals that you find in Germany in particular, where people were cutting particular types of wood to go dowsing for treasure. So they would go out usually certain times of the year, and then they would obviously attempt to find treasure. You had to dig anything up that you found in total silence. Otherwise, the whole thing would fall apart. And you do sort of think that would be a really convenient cover story for if people knew you'd gone out treasure dowsing and you hadn't found anything. You could be like, we totally did. But then one of us spoke and it all disappeared. You also find people dowsing for all sorts of things, really. There's a weird story of a guy actually finding some murderers using dowsing. And you're like, you don't see that on true crime shows. And I actually found, after I wrote the book, that there was an article on the FBI website about dowsing for human remains. And I'm like, ew. Apparently it doesn't really work. But for a long time, it was really recommended as a thing to do. So I think Yeah, it's a dowsing's a funny one because it comes in these two formats of either you're walking around with the rod waiting for it to react to the environment, or you're sitting inside with an image of someone or a map or something that you want to get information about, and then you're dangling something that dangles obviously over it in order to get the information that way. So it's no one, I mean, I keep seeing different people trying to explain how it works, but I think ultimately nobody really knows. But the people who love it have so much success with it. It's like, who cares why it works? Just crack on. It obviously is doing something.
Yeah. I can't help but think of Coraline when you talk about dowsing because it's one of my favorite movies, and it opens with her just exploring her new environment. She's dowsing and it drags her to this well, and that's just like when the story just something's up. But she also uses there's also scry romancy in the film too. So that the story, because there's a very special lens that she has to look through to find. So yeah, I was just thinking about how it's incorporated in that story.
I remember for years because of that, I really wanted to find a hagstone, which is like the stone with a hole in it so that you can look through it. And different bits of folklore say sometimes you'll see witches, sometimes you'll see fairyland and things like that. And I eventually found one and it didn't let me see anything different, which is really frustrating. But you can also kind of just keep them in the house and it wards off danger and things like that. And I'm like, well, maybe mine's that variety then rather than one of the ones where you can see fairyland, because I'm not sure I'd want to if I'm completely honest.
Yeah, we were just talking to Dr. Young about his fairy book, and I learned by researching that you don't actually want to encounter fairies. That's not what you want.
No, not in this light. I love his work anyway. He's absolutely brilliant. But yeah, you do look at the old fairy tales and go, why would anyone be seeking them out? Leave them alone and everything will be fine. Yeah, they are an interesting set of folk, shall we say.
You'd mentioned playing cards earlier. How did they become tangled up with the devil in folklore?
I absolutely love a lot of the stuff about playing cards, and I can't help thinking part of it is, again, probably a class thing because of the fact that playing cards obviously would have been really inexpensive. There was prohibitions against playing them. Oh, was that the 14th century in Paris? Because people just got really distracted with gambling and stuff. So I think because they'd already been associated with things that the authorities didn't want you to do, it was quite easy to then go, we'll just link them with the devil because, you get blamed for everything anyway. And there's loads of legends of people either playing a game of whatever, but they don't have a fourth or fifth player or however many they need. They don't have the final person. And someone just mysteriously rocks up and is like, oh, I can play it. And nobody stops to go, who are you? They just go, yeah, cool, whatever, join in. And then someone invariably drops a card on the floor. And then when they're under the table, they see that the newcomers usually got cloven hooves. And there's quite a lot of famous versions instead where he manages to trick people into playing cards on a Sunday. So there's a really famous story about that for Glamis Castle in Scotland, where this guy just could not get people to play quite late on a Saturday because people were worried the game would go into the Sunday and then, they'd be breaking various sort of church rules. And then this mysterious stranger knocks on the door and he's like, I'll play. And again, you're like, why did that not strike you as a bad idea? Have you not heard these other legends? And of course, obviously, he then gets tricked into playing cards on a Sunday, and then obviously his soul is then forfeit. So I think some of it, the associations come about just because of the nature of what people were using playing cards for as a game rather than the divinatory possibilities. But it's always struck me as a bit odd that the four of clubs then becomes known as the devil's four-post bedstead. And that specific card, it's like, that's really bad luck. And it's kind of funny because even the devil card in tarot doesn't have that many things around it really compared to, some of the ones in playing cards. And it just fascinates me how, I got a pack of playing cards literally for £1 in a stationery shop. So you think this really accessible thing that you can, and everyone's going to have decks lying around the house that they've gotten as free gifts and stuff like that. And then you're like, yeah, no, apparently, you can quite easily summon the devil if you haven't got enough players and all this kind of thing. And I just say it's fascinating how those stories have gradually coalesced as well.
There's so much symbolism with the cards. And recently here in the United States, ICE agents were supposedly moved off field duty during an investigation for leaving a customized ace of spade business card in detainees' cars. So like their family would find the card, and they were called Ice Denver Field Office business cards. Why would they use the ace of spades for that?
It's a really interesting story behind them, and I'm challenging anyone not to have Ace of Spades by Motorhead in their head while we're talking about this now. But it's always been the most important card in the deck, and it's actually got the highest value, which is weird because you'd think it would be one of the kings, really. But it's purely because the printers had to pay stamp duty on them, so they would hand stamp the Ace of Spades, which is why it's always really elaborate compared to the rest of them. So it's kind of a boring reason why the Ace of Spades, it's like essentially for tax purposes, which I guess could also link it to the devil, I don't know. But then I think over time, because it's such a distinctive card, it then became associated with warfare, in particular during the First World War, because the British 12th Division painted it on their tanks. And I suppose when you think about it, it would look a bit weird painting a heart on your tank. So I guess realistically speaking, the spade makes a little bit more sense just visually. And then there are legends that it was then reused during the Vietnam War to stir up the troops and get them kind of spurred on and everything. Although that seems a bit more of a recent inspiration and association and so on. And people who've looked into it, it's kind of struggle sometimes to find out if that was actually true. But then there's all this sort of representational stuff around the fact that if you found the ace of spades just on the ground, and who goes around finding playing cards lying around? But if you did, it meant bad luck. And if the spade was pointing towards you, it meant that treachery was afoot. So it does kind of feel a little bit like ICE were telling on themselves by putting that around places. So I think they're trying to tap into that sort of psychological warfare idea. I'm assuming. I could be wrong, but yeah.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of Vietnam movies where one of the guys has on his helmet, it tucked into the band, he's got an ace of spades right there. And I always wondered, so thank you for sharing why that might be, that they're doing that. Yeah. How is recitation and charms, or charms used with divination?
They're quite cool because, again, with weather omens and also with a lot of love divination. And I suspect it's because when you've got to recite something, if it rhymes, you've got a better chance of remembering it, let's be honest. And I think that over time, performing the action while reciting the charm then becomes the divinatory act itself, which is quite cool, really. And I suppose in a lot of ways, it's that thing where you can pass the information on orally and make sure that the person remembers what it is. And the more you do them, the more you'll remember them. In some cases, it's quite interesting because this isn't to do with divination, but I often wonder if there is a link that when you look at some herbal recipes from like the 9th century and so on, in like Bald's Leech Book and so on, they tell you that you need to recite particular psalms so many times. And it's just purely for timing purposes because they knew how long it took to recite. So you can't say do this for 10 minutes if people don't know how long 10 minutes is, but they know how long that psalm is. So I do sometimes wonder if part of reciting the charm is like a time-based thing, or if it's to focus the attention on what it is that you're actually doing as well. So I'm trying to think of an example, but the one that actually popped into my head was the magpie one. And there's so many different versions of that because like, we have obviously European magpies and they're everywhere. You do sometimes see the same thing associated with crows. And it's that idea of 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy, 5 for silver, 6 for gold, 7 for a secret never to be told is the one I learned. So when you then see up to 7 magpies, you can go, oh, that's what that means. There are versions that actually go all the way up to 10. Although one of my neighbours once saw 20 in one go, and that just feels like a bad thing all round, really. So I have no idea what 20 mean. But again, I think it's a way of remembering people, or reminding people rather, of how to actually use the divination by giving them something that you can repeat. I mean, I learned that when I was about 7. So the fact that I can still remember it now and I can't always remember other things I'm supposed to remember, I think, again, just shows the stickiness that charms then end up with. And often they include the actual instructions for what you're supposed to do as well.
There's a lot of magpies here in Colorado. And when I was reading through your magpie stuff, I was kind of thinking about my experience, what I've observed. And I was kind of jealous because they're not very vocal here. I've been at the cemetery. I've been at the park, national forest. They're there. But here, I haven't actually got to hear them make a racket, and I would like that. That sounds great.
If any of them start making a noise, I'll record it for you, because they sound like, the old-fashioned football rattles where you sort of spin them. They sound like that. They're so noisy.
Wow.
Yeah, I learned that if you don't want to have a bunch of magpies kind of flock you, don't go camping in the mountains in American West and leave dog food out, because they love the kibble.
Okay.
They just pop into your camp while you're sitting there with your dogs. They'll weave between you and grab the kibble because they're so bold.
They are really intelligent. I mean, they're COVID, so of course they are, because we feed some local hedgehogs, which, it's just delightful in and of itself. But they used to actually pull the newspaper that the saucer sits on and pull it out of the box so that they could actually get at the food. And then when my dad started actually taping the paper down so they couldn't pull it out, they just walk in and they just crawl in and help themselves to anything that's left. And it's just like, you just kind of have to let them at that point, because you think, I don't really know how I can stop you other than asking nicely at this point. So you just enjoy your ill-gotten gains there.
Yeah. I would love to talk about body divination. And I had this question, can you tell us about it in a nutshell? And that was kind of a joke because it's so complex and amazing. What I was like really drawn to and what you covered was the shoulder bone, the clavicle stuff. That's fascinating. But anything you would love to tell us about body divination that we should know, that'd be great.
I think the body divination stuff's really weird because of the fact that some of it is being completely debunked, like phrenology and so on. There's no correlation between where the bumps in your skull are and your character. That's just a weird thing. And obviously it's got lots of really horrible connotations and it's used to justify lots of awful things. But then you've got things like palmistry, where it then becomes, what do the lines on your hands mean? Or what do the different mounds and things? And everyone's got on their hands, like, what do they mean? And so on. So obviously it's kind of a way to read the information that's then encoded in the body. But then when you look at how people start using animal body parts instead of human ones, because, I think it will be a lot more difficult to do this with human bits for various reasons. But when you look at sort of the scapular ones that you get in the Naskapi people of what is now Canada, and they would use the shoulder blade of a caribou. So yeah, it's already kind of getting into the realm of sympathetic magic, where you're using the body part of the thing that you're trying to find in order to provide extra information and so on. And then they would essentially use the marks that they would make on the scapula as a map for where to go to then hunt more caribou. And it was fascinating, the research that people did actually looking at these scapulas, because obviously bones take a really long time to degrade. So they're quite a nice way to find evidence of divination that people did in the past. Because otherwise, divination is quite an ephemeral thing that if you don't write down what you did, nobody would ever know that you did it. But with the scapulas, you can actually see how they used them. And because they introduced like a random element into how people were interacting with their environment, it meant that people avoided overhunting particular areas. So instead of always going to the place where they knew the caribou would be, if they then went somewhere completely different by following this map that then ended up generating through scapulomancy, you would end up not overhunting that particular area. So it would let populations have time to regroup and so on like that. And then by comparison, the other one that fascinated me was the one in ancient Mesopotamia with the livers, where they thought that they could almost whisper a question to the sheep and then the gods would write the answer on the sheep's liver, which is really specific. And then they would slaughter the sheep and remove the liver and read like where there were bits of fat, where there were nodules, all that kind of thing. But the cool thing is they made clay models of them and then kind of wrote up notes. So again, they left records and they said, oh, thanks, that's really helpful. So you can see what question they asked, when they asked it, and what the answer was. And you can actually then correlate, cross-reference that with actual historical data to go, were they right? Or were they interpreting that in a favourable way to make the king happy? And so on. So I think it's interesting. You think, why the liver? I suppose it's a large organ, so you couldn't really miss it, And but I didn't come across any kind of divination using something like the brain because it doesn't really hold its shape very well once it's removed from the skull. So I think people possibly tried different body parts and then decided on these particular ones. Then obviously there's the ones in China as well using the turtle shells. where they would apply like hot pokers to them and then see where the cracks went and then read the cracks to determine what the answers were. And again, they left tons of records. So it's like, realistically speaking, these different civilizations and cultures that thought to capture this information it's an absolute goldmine to then look at if you're studying divination to go, what were people doing?
Time has really flown by here. It's been so informative and so just a pleasure to talk to you. What trends do you see in divination and where do you think they're leading us?
I've seen a lot of people going back to the classics. So things like tarot. More and more people are learning playing card divination, which is probably because you can do that in public and nobody would know what you were doing. They would just think you were doing some kind of complicated game for one that they didn't fully understand. I've also seen like the Boolean Oracle, which I haven't got in the book because there's not really a lot of folklore about it in English because it's a French tool. And that's being brought back into use by various readers and so on, which is really cool. And obviously, like people have discovered Lenormand again and things like that. So I think people are expanding into different forms of divination and then experimenting with them and so on. So I think that's really nice to see. The one trend I think is really worrying is the people asking ChatGPT to do divination for them or using it as a divinatory tool, simply because that's not how algorithms work. And, AI tools in general are programmed to tell you what you want to hear. So I don't know how that one's going to pan out, or if at some point the tool itself is just going to go, this isn't helping you at all. Do you want to do something else, maybe? So I think there's always going to be stuff that people will pick up because it'll suddenly become a fad because somebody important will have mentioned it. But it is nice to see how many people start off with one tool and then they're like, oh, but what does this one do? And then what does this one do? And then just invent their own. So I think that the sheer number of oracle decks that you can buy online, and they're beautiful artworks in and of themselves. And obviously it's a nice outlet for illustrators to sort of, obviously have their work basically demonstrated across what was essentially a portfolio at that point. So I think cards are probably always going to be a thing. I think they're really popular. Obviously, without being cynical, they do also look good on Instagram as well. But I think because that's sort of what people might be drawn to. And I have seen more people talking about tea leaf reading as well. So I'm quite excited to see that making a comeback because obviously loose leaf tea, much easier to come by now. So I'm quite hopeful that reading tea leaves sort of has a bit of a resurgence just because it's such an interesting method. And I have seen, and as I say, I know geomancy isn't really in the book, but geomancy is having a really lovely moment right now. And I think because it's got its own rules and things like that, I think that, and there's plenty of people teaching people how to do it as well. So I think that's kind of the trend in that direction. It's like you can actually find someone to teach you how to do it properly. And the internet as a whole, that's why I don't want to dunk too much on AI, because at least the internet is making it easier for people to find people to teach them how to use these different tools or just simply buy them and come across them. So I think, yeah, it's just wider information on the part of the people who are interested and then wider participation by people who want to use them, but maybe don't feed all your information into a large language model, because that just seems like a really weird thing to do.
In your book, you kind of give some starting points and some insight on exploring divination.
Yeah, and I think that it's one of those things, it's really irritating for loads of them. I was kind of like, you'll need to figure this language out for yourself, because it's things like, if you're doing nephomancy and looking at shapes in the clouds, that's going to depend on what you see in them and what you associate with that. So some people might associate an apple with knowledge. Other people might see it as technology. Either of those are equally fair. Somebody else might see it going down the route of like Adam and Eve and all that kind of thing. So I think that people need to develop that confidence in their own interpretive abilities. But then other ones like playing cards and tarot, and there's a grammar that you can learn. And I've given recommendations in the book for people that I'm like, yeah, this person can teach you, and this book's really helpful. So I hope that people can then go and explore further if the book's like a good kind of appetite sort of whetter, I guess. That's a horrible word,
Definitely.
but you know what I mean. Hopefully people can then go further from there.
Yeah, and one good thing that people can do with the internet right now is go online and buy Icy's book.
That's
because it's so good to as a tool just to get you started and point you in the right direction. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Absolute pleasure.
Do you have any other final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Oh, there's a good question. I think what I would love for people to do is just think about how many times in a week they encounter something where they're like, either I wish I knew what to do next, or they were given a message that they maybe didn't recognize. And that could be even just something as simple as fortune cookies. I think that they're like a really, really easy, fun, tasty way to get into divination. And obviously there's an entire chapter on food-based divination in the book, which is really fun because you get to eat a lot of what you use. So that's always helpful. So yeah, I want people to actually think, how much divination have I accidentally been doing?
Thank you, Icy. We really enjoyed your book and this chat.
Listeners, when you pick up your copy of Fate or Fortune, The Art of Divination by Icy Sedgwick, you can support our show by purchasing it from our online bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/endwitchhuts.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.